Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. My name is John Canella. All my friends call me JC. I am 29 years old and of Sicilian descent from the Italian area of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My youth was mostly spent in trouble with a gang of other young Italian guys. We used to think of ourselves as a junior mafia. I'll skip most of the other bad things we got into and focus on one event that seriously changed my wayward behavior. Carmine Vitalio and I were closer than two siblings. We were the same age and hung out with the same gang of guys. The main difference between Carmine and me was the mind. I'm not saying Carmine was dumb or anything, it's just that he couldn't use his head to get out of trouble with the law. Even though he and I did most of the bad things together, he was the one who was usually caught by the police. One night, Carmine and I broke into a warehouse at the port. We were looking for things that could be stolen and earn some money. The guards must have seen us enter the building through the side window. They were waiting for us when we slipped back out the window with several boxes of MP3 players in our hands. One guard grabbed Carmine just as I was climbing through the window. The second guard tried to grab me, but I hit him in the face with the box. I jumped on the back of another guard and hit him on the head with all my might. He let go of Carmine when I knocked him to the ground. I yelled at Carmine to get his ass out of there as fast as possible. Carmine turned and ran away. The second guard came to his senses and grabbed me from behind. There wasn't much of a struggle after that. The guards had a good time with me until the cops showed up. When they arrived, they were laughing along with the guards, examining my battered and bloody body. I was taken to the police station and placed in a pre-trial detention cell until my parents arrived to free me. In short, I never mentioned the name of the other person who was with me in the warehouse. I was given 2 weeks in prison and put on probation. Carmine called me several times to apologize for running away when the guards grabbed me. I told him that everything was fine, because if he had been caught, given his previous arrest, he would have spent a year or more in prison. He swore that he would make amends to me, even if it took him the rest of his life. My parents were angry and humiliated by my arrest. My father beat my ass with his leather belt until it bled. Then I was told that they were going to enroll me in St. Peter's Catholic High School because I needed to reform one way or another. Needless to say, the nuns and the priests did a very good job in the discipline department. By the time I graduated, I had changed my lifestyle. One of the priests, who became my mentor, advised me to choose a different path in life. And so it was. I quit the gang and finally succeeded enough that year to go to the University of Pennsylvania. In short, I did well in college and graduated with a degree in human resources. After graduation, it was easy to find a job in a good company. This time my parents were proud of me. Even though I dated a lot of women while I was in college, I wasn't ready for any long-term commitments. It was 3 years after I graduated from college when I met Janet Fasanio. She was the first woman who made me think about ending my bachelor life. We met at a seminar for representatives of the HR department. After the seminar, I took her phone number and said I would call her. She seemed quite pleased with the prospect. Janet was different from all the other women I've dated. There seemed to be many sides to her personality. At times, Janet seemed like Chris Costner Sizemore in the movie 3 Faces of Eve. The trait I liked the least was Janet's stubborn personality. Whenever Janet made a decision on any particular issue, it was impossible to dissuade her from her beliefs, no matter how wrong they were. Our courtship was an affair. We never indulged in a relationship during the first year of our acquaintance. I found out that Janet was abandoned in infancy. Her mother left her in a pew at the back of the church and walked out of her life. Her early years were spent in an orphanage and then in several foster homes when she became a teenager. I firmly believe that it was the absence of a mother who loved and cared for her that caused most of Janet's personal problems. Despite all her problems, Janet was the most loving and warm person I ever knew when she was with me in those early years. My parents weren't strong supporters of Janet in the years we were dating. They always told me that I would regret if I got too carried away with her. I didn't listen to their good advice. Janet and I got married in a small ceremony at the local church. Janet and I both agreed that we would postpone having children until we were financially settled, and she could quit her job and become a full-fledged mother. This fact did not suit my parents. In the 3rd year of our marriage, everything went wrong. The company Janet worked for was bought out by a larger company, and her workplace was liquidated. She was very upset about losing her job, which she really liked. We didn't have any financial difficulties, although her salary was a good amount that could be added to our savings account every month. It took several months before Janet finally found a new job. It wasn't the kind of job she particularly wanted. This job was an office manager at the Calcus real estate agency. I tried to support Janet during her unemployment. Sometimes I felt that she resented the fact that I had a job that I really liked, and she had to settle for a second-rate job. For a long time, she had serious mood swings, especially during her period. After working for a couple of months, she gradually began to regain her usual pleasant personality. Things started to look better for both of us. Our lives, which suffered greatly during Janet's unemployment, were also on the rise. There were times in our bedroom when I felt Janet was trying very hard to make amends by being more aggressive in our lovemaking. I've never complained. For about 9 months, our married life was at its best. Janet became very enthusiastic about her work. She even started taking real estate courses. I was pleased with the change in her behavior and what a loving wife she was to me. Then there was the good news and bad news situation. Good news. I have been slowly but steadily moving up the management ladder in my company. I worked with them for 5 years and my future looked very promising. Then there was a merger with a company based in Atlanta, Georgia, which marked the beginning of a major change in my job responsibilities. The Atlanta company had to be integrated into our corporate structure. As such, I was responsible for training their staff and reducing staff numbers as needed. I was really excited about my new job responsibilities. Bad news. My new assignments would mean that I would leave the city more often. Janet wasn't thrilled at the prospect of me spending so much time on the road. Even during longer periods on the road, I was able to stay at home on weekends. At first, it seemed to calm Janet's anger that I was away so much. But, and there is always a but, gradually, my return home for the weekend didn't seem enough to make up for the time I spent away from home. Janet went into her stubborn mindset, in which she claimed that I liked being away from home, and she subtly hinted that I might have a mistress with whom I spent time in Atlanta. Nothing I could do or say could distract her from this negative thinking. I called her at work during the day and every evening when she was at home. I sent her flowers at work and sent her humorous postcards over the internet. Her coldness towards me continued. It took almost 6 months to complete staff training in Atlanta. My days as a road warrior were coming to an end. Besides, I got a promotion at corporate headquarters. These were 2 things that I felt should have changed Janet's attitude towards me. I was wrong. It seemed that as soon as I stopped traveling, Janet started working at the agency longer. I tried to ask her about the reasons for her overwork. She gave me some kind of sarcastic answer that it was her turn to work for a promotion. She even said it was time for me to find out what it was like to be alone in the evenings. Our lives have almost stopped. 2 weeks ago, Janet told me that she and several employees of her agency would be leaving for the weekend to attend a special orientation session with a developer who was starting construction of high-rise condominiums by the river. She said she needed to get to this developer. No one asked me if it would be okay if she left for the whole weekend. She was going to leave, and that was the end of the discussion. Although I stopped communicating with the youth mafia when I was in high school, I kept in touch with several of my closest friends, especially my friend Carmine. I called him and asked if he wanted to watch the Steelers. The game was on Sunday. There was no hesitation in his voice. We were going to the game. Carmine always knew how to get the best tickets to Steelers games. I told him that Janet would be away on business on Saturday and Sunday. Then he told me to plan to spend the weekend with him and the boys. We could remember all the shit that was going on in the old neighborhood. The idea of a weekend away from home and my wife seemed really wonderful to me. I didn't bother to tell Janet about my plans. Friday morning was another cold event for us at breakfast. I briefly asked Janet if I could contact her while she was away. She very coolly told me not to bother calling her while she was away because she would be with some very influential people. Answering her husband's phone calls would make her feel like I was a father checking on my teenage daughter. I didn't press the issue any further. In the afternoon, Janet took her luggage and went to the airport and on to Atlantic City. Carmine was very happy to see me. It's been over a year since we've been dating. It seems like I was one of the few guys from the junior mafia who managed to get out of the old neighborhood before spending some time in jail. Carmine also reminded me of the outstanding debt he owed me. If you need anything, JC, just call me and I'll take care of it for you. We spent Saturday evening at the Sweet Pussycat Lounge Bar in the southeastern part of the city. The strip club could easily pass for the Buddha Bing Club on The Sopranos show. There were a dozen or more young, scantily clad women dancing on stage and kneeling in the audience. A sweet young thing, she was no more than a day older than her 18th birthday, came up and started shaking her smooth ass in front of my face. Come on, JC. She's yours for the night if you want her, Carmine said. I'm sorry, Carmine, but you know me. I am always faithful to my wedding vows. I can't say that I'm not seriously tempted, but I believe in loyalty and dedication. I looked at the lovely young stripper and just shook my head. No. She pouted for a second and then moved on to try her luck with another male client. Damn it. You really take that loyalty seriously, don't you, JC? Carmine said with some disbelief in his voice. You got it right. There is nothing without loyalty. No love. No marriage. The next morning was a typical cold, windy day in Pittsburgh. But it didn't matter to the crowd of fans who went to Three Rivers Stadium to watch the game between the Steelers and the Raiders. There is a fierce rivalry between these two football teams that borders on gang warfare. Ever since the Steelers snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in one of the NFL's most memorable moments. Thanks to Franco's lucky rebound, Harris found himself at the end of an unlikely move that changed the outcome of a fantastic defensive struggle against the Oakland Raiders in the first ever playoff game at Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. None of the teams has forgotten about this legacy. It is good that weapons are prohibited on the playing field. The Steelers didn't have the best year. At this point in the season, they have had 5 wins and 5 losses. Today was supposed to be the biggest game of the season. Silver and black returned to the city. It was hard, banging my head on the football field all day. I was hoarse from all these screams and screams, but the final score was 21 for the Steelers, 20 for the Raiders. The day couldn't have ended on a better note. At least that's what I thought. As much as Carmine wanted me to stay and hang out with the rest of the guys, I had to take my leave and tell him, another time. It was going to be a hard day at the office tomorrow, and I knew I didn't need a hangover on top of all the other workloads. Besides, Janet was coming home tonight, and I wanted to be there when she got back. Janet did not return home on Sunday evening. I left for work on Monday morning with some serious doubts arising in my mind about the latest developments in my marriage. Whenever I thought deeply about the state of the relationship between Janet and me, I had a feeling of impending doom. Of course, there were irregularities in all marriages, but perhaps our marriage turned into something more than just irregularities. The working day was as stressful as I thought when I left the house in the morning. Several high-level meetings and a harassment lawsuit brought against the company were high on my agenda. It wasn't until 5:30 that I had the opportunity to sit down and check my email. There were a dozen emails from staff along with the latest information on the lawsuit. Near the end of the list of emails, there was one that seemed to pop off the screen. It was titled, "Who will be the last to know about this?" When I opened the email expecting to see some humorous cartoon, I suddenly came across a photo of Janet and another man passionately hugging and kissing on the lips. There was a text message at the bottom of the photo that simply said, "Do you want to know what happened after that? Click on the following link." A chill ran down my spine as I hesitated for a moment, looking at the photo of Janet kissing another man. Then I clicked on the following link. Another photo appeared on the screen. This time, Janet and the man she was kissing were naked and standing hugging in a motel room. Again, there was a text message at the bottom of the photo that simply said, "Do you want to know what happened after that? Click on the following link." My hand was shaking, and something tightened in my throat and chest as the image of my wife was imprinted in my brain. There was a part of me that didn't want to see the next photo, but still I knew I had to click on the link. The next photo was the end of my marriage. Janet was on her hands and knees on the bed. Janet had an expression of lust and ecstasy on her face. The only woman I've ever really loved was just a cheating, adulterous cheater. I loved her and trusted her with all my heart. Now she was ripping that heart out of my chest. The text at the bottom of the photo simply read, "The photo is provided by Robert Toldson. My worst nightmare has just been thrown in my face." There was no doubt that Janet's coldness towards me in the last couple of months was more than just a wife angry at her husband. Her coldness was akin to rigor mortis in our dying marriage. What follows anger and rage? For me, it was a calm determination that I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the determination to take revenge that is now settled in my mind. I will not tolerate infidelity and betrayal in my life. There were 2 people who would pay for the deadly insult they knowingly inflicted on me. My first thoughts were about the person who sent me the compromising emails. There was no name or other indication of where the email was sent from. The questions kept spinning in my head. Why would someone send me this email? What do they hope to gain by exposing my wife's infidelity? Were they my friends or Janet's enemies? I will have to solve this problem later. I inserted the CD into my computer and made a copy of the email along with 3 photos. Then I deleted the email and ran a cleanup program after that, which erased that email from my hard drive. I leaned back in my swivel chair trying to figure out why Janet had betrayed our marriage. The only explanation I could think of was to blame Janet's split personality. And yet, if she wanted a divorce, I would have given her a divorce. We didn't have any children, and we both could have walked away from this marriage breakdown. But now my revenge will be swift and complete. I would not have taken prisoners and would not have shown mercy to any of them. A plan began to take shape in my head. I left the office building and turned the corner to a payphone. The number I dialed was an untraceable mobile phone with a minute-by-minute payment. Carmine, I think it's time for me to repay the debt you owe me. When I got home around 7:30, Janet was already at home watching TV. She didn't get up and run over to hug and kiss me. She just looked up and just said, "You're coming home late." "Just like you," was my simple answer as I moved into the kitchen. Nothing more was said between the two of us. I took a beer from the fridge and walked down the hall to the spare room that I had converted into an office. I locked the door behind me. When a person is convicted of a serious crime in this country, usually one of 2 sentences can be imposed on the perpetrator: death penalty or life imprisonment. In my revenge plan, there was 1 death penalty and 1 life sentence. I needed some quiet time to think about the rest of my revenge plan. Carmine will contribute to settling accounts with Mr. Robert Toldson for me. Settling accounts with Janet would be a personal effort on my part. I had to put everything in place so that revenge would seem to the police to be a simple matter of a wife running away from her loving husband. Over the next few days, I continued to send flowers to Janet's office so that everyone could see that her loving husband still cares about her. I booked a table for dinner at a restaurant near where she worked. I left messages for her to meet me there for dinner. She never showed up. I told the waitress to give our table to someone else. I made sure that she remembered how my wife left me. Janet returned home later that evening. There was no explanation for not showing up for our dinner. The thing is, I just didn't give a damn about anything she could say in her defense. The die was cast. The wheels of revenge were in motion. Later the next day, a courier came to my office and handed me an envelope marked "Personal and Confidential." There was a single sheet of paper in it. The headline was printed in bold: "Destroy it after reading it." The first sentence simply said, "Provide yourself with a reliable alibi for tomorrow night." The second sentence had a name, Carlos Mandara, and a phone number. I read and reread the phone number until I memorized it. The piece of paper was then sent through a paper shredder. I picked up the torn pieces to take with me. They will be thrown into several different trash cans next to the office building. I got home from work earlier than Janet that evening. I changed my clothes, poured myself a Jim Beam, and sat down to listen to my favorite jazz. The TV didn't turn on tonight. This was supposed to be my night as the king of my castle. Janet will have to find some way to entertain herself. When Janet returned home, there was no confrontation with her. She quickly assessed the situation, turned around, and walked out the door again. I'm not sure where she was going, maybe to eat, maybe to meet Robert Toldson again. I wouldn't care. The sand in the hourglass was almost empty for the 2 of them. I was in bed when Janet finally came home and quietly slipped into bed next to me. The silence was the loudest sound that could be heard before I fell asleep. Thursday night is a regular poker night for a few guys from work. I participated in the game a couple of times, just to keep in touch with the guys from the office. It's amazing what nuggets of information you can find when guys are relaxing with a few drinks in them. The game was played in the back room of an old stagecoach bar. It was supposed to be my ironclad alibi for the rest of the evening. This time it was me who went to bed early in the morning. The clock on my bedside table showed 2:35 when I pulled the blanket over me. There was no sound, no movement on Janet's part. It wasn't hard for me to fall asleep, even though I knew what had happened some time ago that evening. Now that Robert Toldson has been sentenced to death, it is time to punish the second offender. No immediate action was required for a life sentence. The fact that Janet's punishment would begin shortly after I made the phone call gave me a sense of satisfaction and justice. Whatever it was about Janet's twisted personalities that made her feel like she could blatantly disrespect me in the most disgusting way, it had to be determined by someone else. I no longer felt any compassion for the woman I once loved with all my heart and soul. The retribution that was about to befall her was her own doing. The police interviewed all employees of the Calcas real estate agency. They received some interesting but contradictory statements from the staff. Janet was one of the people the police questioned more than once. Detective Lawrence Buckton stopped by the house that evening and asked me what I might know about Robert Toldson. I told the detective that I had only met Robert once. It was at a Christmas party that Calcus hosted for all of its employees and their spouses. Other than that one time, I haven't seen or spoken to Mr. Toldson. The detective tried to ask a few questions, concluding that Robert and Janet may have been more than just agency employees. I told him that I fully believe in my wife's loyalty and see no reason to doubt her loyalty. He just smiled at me, as if he thought I was a poor, pathetic cuckold. Robert Toldson's funeral took place on Tuesday. That morning I saw Janet dressed in her morning black dress, the same one she wore at my mother's funeral. She didn't ask me if I wanted to go to Robert's funeral with her. Whatever she thought about Robert's death, she kept it to herself. I'm sure she had a lot to think about, including murder and her infidelity. Several times over the next week, Janet seemed to want to start a serious discussion about our relationship. My cold attitude towards her quickly led to her attempts being stopped immediately. I was beyond any form of reconciliation. I had my finger on the button, and I could press it any time I wanted to end this charade. 3 weeks after Robert's murder, the police investigation seemed to have stopped. The police have not been able to find any new leads. Someone pointed out that there was a possibility that Robert could have been killed by a loan shark or a bookie. During these 3 weeks, Janet's mental state continued to deteriorate. She seemed more distracted and confused. Little things seemed to scare her. I did not offer her any help or comfort, although I could see that she was having a hard time. Suffer, you fool, I thought to myself, watching her slowly fall apart. Finally, the following Thursday, I called Carlos. He already had a plan ready, and he couldn't wait to start implementing it. Janet had only a few hours left before her new life would begin. I left for work on Friday morning before Janet got dressed. I didn't want to see her in my house this last time. The sand in the hourglass was empty. A car with 2 men in it was parked across the street from our house. The abduction took place at an intersection where there was a 4-lane stop sign. Cars in front and behind Janet's car blocked any attempts by her to move. With the precision of the Delta Force Command, the 2 men took action. As soon as the driver's door opened, a needle was inserted into her arm when the seatbelt was cut from her body. Janet was pushed into the passenger seat when one of the men got behind the wheel. The 3 cars drove off quickly. The total time spent was less than 30 seconds. There were no witnesses. At 11 o'clock that morning, at a bank branch located in the eastern part of the city, a woman dressed and looking exactly like Janet entered the bank and handed the cashier a receipt for withdrawing $25,000 from our joint account. The lady had a driver's license and a passport as an identity card. It took the cashier several minutes to receive the withdrawal of funds in the form of a cash receipt. The guard escorted the woman to her car. He noticed the license plate when the woman was leaving the parking lot. The queue of passengers at the American Airlines ticket office was not very long when a woman who looked like Janet walked towards the smiling clerk behind the counter. She took the boarding pass, showing the clerk her photo ID and passport. Flight reservations were made online the night before. The first leg of the trip was to JFK Airport, followed by nonstop flight 951 to Rio de Janeiro. Her flight took off from Pittsburgh at 4:45 p.m. for JFK Airport in New York. Then at 10:30 that evening, the American Airlines plane took off from the runway, taking passenger Janet Canella on an overnight flight to Brazil. I waited until noon on Saturday before calling the police to report a missing person. Surprisingly, Detective Lawrence Buckton was the officer who came to the house to take the report. I told him that Janet had not returned home at her usual time. I tried to call her on her mobile, but I got a notification that she wasn't working. I called Amanda Stockade, one of Janet's close friends at Calcus. Amanda told me that Janet didn't show up for work yesterday. She didn't even call to report. Detective Buckton was making some mysterious notes in his little notebook. He looked up at me from time to time. Finally, he started asking questions about my marriage. Did we have any problems, and did they have anything to do with Janet's disappearance? I told him the same thing I told him when he questioned me after Robert Toldson's murder. Our marriage was wonderful, and I couldn't think of any reason why Janet would voluntarily disappear. Then he asked me if I had anything to do with the foul play involving Janet. I told him again that I love my wife and I can't hurt her. Lying to the police was an acting trait that I developed at a very early age while working with the youth mafia. It still worked well for me. 3 days had passed when Detective Buckton came to my office during office hours. I think he wanted to personally evaluate the husband he was dealing with. After he was shown into my office, he sat down and gave me a strained smile. "Do you have any news about Janet's whereabouts?" I had a frustrated husband's face when I asked him if he knew anything about Janet. "Yes and no, Mr. Cannella. We followed Janet's actions a little bit after she left your house on Friday morning. Several people claim to have seen her drinking coffee at Denny's restaurant on Bennett Street around 10 a.m. on Friday. She then showed up at Allegheny National Bank around 11 a.m. We have CCTV footage of her at the cash register withdrawing $25,000 from your joint savings account." Buckton stopped to assess the shocked expression on my face. My acting must have passed the test, as I asked in shocked amazement. "Janet withdrew $25,000 from our savings account? It's impossible. She didn't tell me anything about wanting to withdraw money." The facts are pretty clear. The cashier made photocopies of Janet's driver's license and her passport before writing out the cashier's check. I am sure that as soon as you see the surveillance footage, you will be able to identify the man in the cashier's window as your wife, Janet. Once again, Buckton stopped to assess my reaction to his exposure. "I still think there must be some mistake, Detective. Janet and I talked about everything that's going on in our marriage. I'm sure she would have told me if she needed a large amount of money." My confused look confirmed my words as I stared at the police detective again. I knew that the detective was holding back the most terrible news until the last. I had to prepare for another encore. "The most disturbing news, Mr. Cannella, is that your wife has bought flights to New York and on to Rio de Janeiro. We found her car in the long-term parking lot at the airport. Her flight took off from Pittsburgh on Friday afternoon at 4:45 a.m., and then her flight to Rio took off from New York at 10:30 a.m. We contacted the Rio de Janeiro police in the hope of finding Janet. It seems she disappeared as soon as she arrived in Rio." Buckton was now staring at me intently, waiting for my reaction. No, this is crazy," I shouted at him. "Janet would never do anything like that. I know she loves me and I love her. Leaving the country is nonsense. Come on, Buckton." I was saying this while playing out the scenario of a devoted husband for a detective. I started crying right in front of him. There was silence in my office for a minute or so before the detective spoke again. "Do you think this has something to do with the murder of Robert Toldson?" "What? How dare you even ask this question? My wife has nothing to do with this murder. You interrogated her yourself." "She has never been accused of anything related to this case." "We never charged your wife, Mr. Cannella, but she was at the top of our list of suspects. Several other people we interviewed told us that they suspected that your wife and Mr. Toldson were lovers." His eyes seemed to drill holes in my head. "You've got to be kidding. First you tell me all this nonsense about my wife leaving the country, and then you accuse her of involvement in the Toldson murder. You better have more evidence than some office gossip to back it up." My eyes were drilling holes in his head. "We're still working on this case, Mr. Cannella. Now that your wife has left the country, our suspicions of her involvement in the murder have increased." He paused for a long moment. There was evidence at the crime scene that the murder was more than just a gang raid for money. The wounds on Toldson's body indicated that there was a sexual connotation to the murder. Toldson was tortured and beaten for several hours before he was strangled. I let out a small laugh when I answered. "And you think my petite wife did all this? She can barely open a jar of pickles, let alone strangle someone. Your accusations seem to get more ridiculous every time you open your mouth. I wanted it to sound like I was mad at Buckton." "Maybe so, Mr. Cannella, but all the evidence still points to your wife's involvement. Maybe someone else helped her." He paused, licked his lips. "And you think I was that other person?" I shot him back before he said another word. "We thought you might have been involved, but you had a solid alibi for the time of the murder." His voice sounded unconvincing. "Okay, let me get this straight. You came here today telling me you haven't found my wife, but you think she left the country because she was involved in a murder. You also hinted that I was a likely suspect in helping her with this murder." I paused, staring straight at him. "So I got it right, Detective?" He just sat there looking back at me, trying to determine if my outrage was just false bravado. "Is there anything else, Detective?" I asked with a hint of contempt in my voice. "If not, then this meeting is over." I got up from the table and headed for the closed door. I opened the door to show him that it was time for him to leave. Buckton got up from his chair and walked slowly to the door. Thank you for your time, Mr. Canela. I'll keep you posted on the search for your wife. He didn't hold out his hand, and I didn't hold out mine. I closed the door after the detective left and leaned back in my swivel chair. I was sure that Buckton's visit was intended to find out more information than to give me any substantial information about these two cases. I slowly considered every statement he made and every question he asked. He was sure he felt that I might have been involved in one or both of the cases he was involved in. Nevertheless, my alibi was reliable. I was playing poker that Thursday night when Robert Toldson was killed, and I was at meetings all day last Friday when Janet went missing. It was Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Janet disappeared. I haven't heard anything from Carlos or Carmine. I had no idea where Janet was or what had been happening to her in the last 2 weeks. There were several times when I had a distinct feeling that I was being watched when I went to work in the morning and when I returned home in the evening. My movements were very carefully planned. To work, back home, and grocery shopping on the way home. Nothing that could be mistaken for an evasive move or the actions of someone trying to hide something. I called Buckton every other day to find out about my missing wife. He had nothing new to say. Brazilian police found no evidence of Janet's presence after her arrival in Rio. That day, I called Domino's to order pizza while I was sitting and watching football on TV. The doorbell rang, and the pizza delivery guy was standing there with my hot pizza. I paid him and tipped him a couple bucks. When I opened the pizza box in the kitchen, there was an envelope on top of the pizza. I opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. Be at church tomorrow morning. Go to Mass at 10 o'clock at St. Peter's Cathedral. During communion, slip out through the side door on the east side of the church. A dark Ford Crown Victoria will be waiting for you outside. Get in. I held the piece of paper in my hand, knowing that this would be the last meeting with Janet before Carlos sent her out of the country. He waited 2 weeks to make sure that Janet's cover plan for flying out of the country would be well documented, and that was all the evidence the police had to work on. It was an elaborate deception set up by Carlos to steer the investigation in the wrong direction. He also established the fact that Janet was alive when she boarded the plane to Rio. That way, the police wouldn't be able to try to prove that I killed Janet, even though no body was found. The bedroom was completely dark when I stared at the ceiling. The last 6 weeks have been a real waking nightmare for me. After receiving this email, the chain of events that happened reminded me that my ancestral roots would always reveal the dark side of my personality whenever someone showed me disrespect. Nature or nurture? I had no doubt where my dark side came from. St. Peter's Cathedral is a very large church. Mass at 10 o'clock is attended by several hundred parishioners. It was easy to get lost in this crowd and notice if anyone was watching me. If the police were following me, they must have been waiting outside the church. As the crowd of people moved to the front of the church for communion, I quickly slipped out the side door. A dark Ford sedan was waiting with the engine running. I got into the back seat as the car roared out onto a busy street. The ride took about 10 minutes before the sedan stopped in front of a large warehouse building. The driver didn't even turn around. He just told me to enter the building through the side door. The inside of the large building was very empty. Next to the back was an office area, with light streaming from several windows. As I approached the office, Carlos came out and walked towards me. This was my first personal meeting with Carlos. "Hi, JC." He paused and smiled. "Carmine told me it would be nice to call you JC. His hand was outstretched and I shook it. "Are you sure you want to see your wife again?" The last few weeks have not been very pleasant for her. Carlos kept a stony expression on his face. His words were a warning that I might get upset when I see Janet this time. "I don't care what she looks like anymore or what she's been through since you took her away." I headed for the open door. "Is she taking illegal substances now?" I asked, stopping at the door. "No, but I'm sure she would like it to be so. I kept her clean and very conscious all the time. Now she is a broken woman and well prepared for her new life." We both entered a well-lit room. Janet was standing in the center of the room. She was completely naked. Her arms were stretched above her head. Her wrists were tied together and attached to a chain that descended from the ceiling. Her legs were spread apart and held in place by struts. She ignored my presence, standing there motionless. I went to the place where she was chained. Her dull, empty eyes were staring straight ahead as I approached her naked body. She didn't make a sound. I didn't tell her anything. When I examined her body, the first thing that caught my attention was the piercing on her body. There were several piercings on her navel, one of which was also connected by a thin gold chain with a gold ring. There was something very beautiful about seeing Janet decorated with gold rings and chains. And yet, no matter how beautiful they were, there was a very sinister meaning behind them. I slowly walked around her stretched-out body. I could see faint traces of red marks covering most of her back. No doubt she was severely flogged when she was first abducted by Carol's men. My eyes stopped moving over her bare back when I noticed a fresh mark on her lower back. The brand was a coiled snake about 4 inches in diameter. Her new owner insisted that she be branded with his mark before she was sent to him. Carlos paused and then added, "You really don't want to know his name?" "She hasn't said anything to me since I entered the room." "Did you do something to her tongue?" I asked Carlos quietly, approaching her from the other side. He grinned at me and replied, "We also pierced her tongue, but the reason she didn't tell you anything is because I forbade her to speak until I gave her my permission. If she had spoken without my permission, she would have been severely punished. She already knows what this punishment is like." He took a deep breath and finished his comment. "I told you, she's a broken woman. She has no will of her own. She does everything I tell her without hesitation. I walked around her and stood right in front of her. We were inches apart. She still didn't say anything. Her gaze was directed right over my shoulder. There was no sparkle and vitality in her eyes anymore. For the rest of your life, Janet, you will remember that you brought all this suffering on yourself. I put up with all your mood swings and your cold attitude towards me, but I couldn't accept your infidelity. For the disrespect and cuckolding that has befallen me, you will now spend the rest of your life paying the price for your adultery. Robert has already paid his debt to me. He has ended his life." My words were spoken slowly and clearly as I looked into her exhausted face. I wanted her to know that I was the one who brought her lover to justice and about his terrible death. No matter how much I loved you once, I want you to know that it's as much as I hate you now. Carlos assured me that wherever you are sent, you will be well taken care of, just as well as they take care of their best horses and cattle. I stood there for another second when I saw a large tear roll down Janet's cheek. It was all the recognition and awareness I got from her. Her body remained motionless as I turned and left the room. The Ford sedan took me back to St. Peter's Cathedral, where I entered when Mass was just ending at 11 o'clock. I left the church and drove straight home from the parking lot. I had a tight knot in my stomach that needed to be covered with some Jim Beam. The epilogue. It's been 3 years since I last saw Janet. I had almost completely forgotten about her. There are no more traces of her in my life. I even sold the house we lived in during her disappearance. Both of Buckton's cases were moved to the unsolved cases folder. I do spend more time with Carmine at the Cute Kitty. I have tried all the suggestions of this cute young stripper more than once. Marriage is out of the question for me. My 5 years with Janet were enough to convince me that women are more trouble than they're worth when you marry them. My parents were right to regret my affair with Janet. Someone once told me that children should listen to their parents' advice. Children rarely listen. P.S. Later I found out that it was Amanda Stockada who sent me an email. It seems she was Robert Toldson's lover before he left her for Janet. I never thanked her for the email and never found out how she got these photos of Robert and Janet. I think she took revenge on both of them. All this is the anger of an offended woman. Perhaps it would be wise to add, "Don't make love to JC."